Today we're going to be painting a simple little watercolor strawberry jam jar. For my supplies, I'm going to be using a Princeton Artist Select size 3 round brush, as well as a small size 0 for any finishing details that are needed. And then for paint, I'm using Winsor & Newton Cotman watercolors that I have set up in my palette here. So let's get started. Just going to mix up some red for the base of our jar. And we'll be using the same red for the jar and also a little bit for the lid. I have my design lightly traced out here just so I have a general guide. You don't have to do that, but I find that it does help decide where to put down the paint. I'm going to start by using this watered down red and just put down the general outline of the jar, and then we'll fill that in. So a good amount of water, but still quite concentrated color here so that I can get the general outline down. And we can always drop in a little bit of color after to add some depth, so it doesn't need to be super concentrated yet. And just going under the edge of where the jam lid will be up here. And then leaving a square in the middle for where the label will be. Try to move a bit quickly with this part, just so it doesn't dry before I get down the water to spread out that color. I'm going to grab some water so I can spread out all of that red to fill in the whole jar shape. Using water and a bit of the color just to keep the whole thing nice and wet, which will allow us more time to play with the amount of color we want to put in it. Now that that's done, you can grab some more red and make a bit of a more concentrated version here. Then you can just drop in a bit of color where you want it around the edges, anywhere you want it to be more pigmented. I'm choosing not to use a bunch of shading or color theory on this one, as I want it to be kind of a more modern, simple design, but you can make it as complicated or simple as you'd like. It's whatever feels right for you, but I'm just trying to keep mine a bit simple and straightforward. And then you can dry off your brush a bit, so you can pick up some of that color if you want it lighter in some areas while it's wet. So while there's water here, if you dry it off, you can pick up the pigment and get a little bit of that white to show through underneath, which is another way to get the outside edges to be darker than the middle. Now while that's drying, I'm going to start painting some of the pattern on the lid here. So again, taking watered down red, I'm going to do some overlapping stripes. I want to make sure that this is not totally wet still, so I don't want it to run together when I'm adding this. Mine seems okay. If yours isn't dry yet, maybe just give it a moment to dry before adding this next one. And just put some of that color down in a really light wash. And then do the same thing after leaving a bit of a gap here and add the next stripe. And I'm just curving it up a little at the end here where the top of the jar will be, because that part is kind of where you're looking down at it, so it can curve in a bit that way. And leave another gap and do this next stripe here, and just repeat the same thing, alternating white space and then putting down a band of this very light color. And curving it at the top here where the jar will curve over, and my stripes are getting a little bit narrower once we get to the edge because those sides are fading away from the front view. So they'll be smaller than the ones right in front. Okay. And then for this next one, the stripes are going to start going across. So the edge of my lid actually starts over here where that first lighter stripe is. And then we'll bring it all the way across like that, still keeping it a very light wash so that it lets that other row beneath it shine through without overworking it so that we don't lose some of those lines that we added in the first place. If your lines do disappear a bit because you're layering on top, maybe it's still a bit wet underneath, you can always add some detail afterwards. So it's not a huge deal. Making sure this is a bit dry and moving on to this next one that's going to be kind of at the top of the jar here. So curving it in a little bit. There we go. I think I'm going to add a tiny little line over here as well for the very edge of the jar where that last stripe would be peeking through. No real rules here, just do whatever feels right. And I'll do one more little line up here. There we go. Now I'm going to move on to the jar itself again. I want to add a bit more of a red wash over top now that the first one is dried, because I want it to be a little bit darker than the lid up top. So I'm just going to grab a bit more of that watered down red, maybe with a tiny bit more color in it, and just add that around here. And especially here under the lid. You can also use some color theory here where you can add a bit of blue to add depth and shading, but I'm not always a fan of that in every painting. It just depends on the look you're going for. Sometimes I want it to look a bit more like a more modern, simple style. So I'm just going to keep this one pretty straightforward, but you can feel free to experiment if that sounds interesting to you. And then taking more water and just washing out some of that shading around the edge. And bringing it back to the edge of the label. And just dropping in a bit more of that color again. So now we essentially did the first thing as we did with the first wash. Or sorry, we did the same thing as we did with the first wash, but just added a bit more color on the second go to make it more concentrated than the lid above. Now, the next thing we can work on is the little berry in the middle. So we can take some of that red again. I'm going to go a bit more concentrated this time because I don't want it to be super duper light. So making sure that I have a good amount of color on my brush. And I'm just going to do the outline of a little berry here, leaving some gaps for a stem on the top of it as well. So there's going to be a couple little green stems here. And then outline of a little strawberry. Just a cute little berry on our jam jar. And just fill that in. Work on getting the shape you'd like, and drop a bit more color on the edges. Dry the brush if you want to pick up some of the color in the middle. So add a bit of water in the center there, dry off the brush, and just pick some of that up to get that nice curve. That looks good now. I'll have to let that strawberry dry because I don't want to do too much wet on wet. I don't want the green to run together with the center of the strawberry. So I'm going to leave that to dry while I move back up here and do a really light wash. I'm going to take a little bit of this red, water it down even more. So I'm going to put the lightest wash between the stripes of red at the top there. Might even put a tiny drop of yellow to get it a bit of an orange tone, just so it's not all the same kind of red. But really this is mostly just water. So honestly, just adding water with the tiniest hint of color, just so it's not totally white between. Just going to use that to add a little bit of dimension to the edges here, where the white stripes are. So kind of bringing some of it down here, here. And you can bring it up a little bit, but I don't want to totally take over the variation between the color and the white. So really keeping it very, very light. I'm going to dry off my brush a bunch and pick some of that up just to give it the tiniest bit of color at the edge. You could bring some of it up through these other squares if you'd like as well. But personally, I don't want to go over those other lines. I just want to add a little bit so that it's not totally white between, but I'd like to keep the original stripes really defined. So I'm not going to do too much here. Basically, it's just water. Now that that's finished, our berry should be dry enough to work around here. Now we're going to mix up some green for the stem. Just grab a bit of green and make a color that looks right to you. I want mine to be a little bit yellowish, a little bit green. I'm gonna add a little yellow to mine. And once you have your green, you can grab your brush and start putting that stem down. And if you're worried to do the really precise stem with the bigger size 3 brush, you can switch to your detailed brush as well. I like to just use the tip of mine. You want to keep control of how much water you put on it so it doesn't kind of overflow the shape that you're trying to make. So I'll just show how I do it with this one, and then I can switch to the detailed brush as well. I'm just going to do 3 little stems going down here. And I'll switch to the detailed brush to show how I would do it with that one. Pretty much the same thing. You're just going to get less water and paint on the brush each time, so you have maybe a bit more control. I think I'll do 3 little stems up top. There we go. I'll probably round out the edge of that strawberry after as well once that green has dried. But while we have the green here, you can also drop in a bit more at the edges if you want it to be more concentrated. So grab some green that's not as watered down, and you can dab little bits of it into there, and it'll kind of spread throughout while it's still wet. Put a little bit of color and use a little bit of water to help it along. And we'll let that part dry. I'm just going to start adding some brown. I'm just going to plop mine in to where this red was. And just start adding some brown to make it kind of a darker reddish brown. And take that brown and just make a stripe, the line going across where the edge of the jar is here. By now, all my stripes are nice and dry. And then grab some water, drop it in, because I like the center to look a bit less pigmented. So personally, I like to put a bit of water in there, dry my brush, and pick some of that color up. Looks like my light color wasn't totally dry there. That's okay. Can grab a bit of paper towel and just kind of mop that up. And if you get to it quick before it spreads too much, it gives you a chance to intercept before it bleeds together, although can be a nice look as well, but I want a nice defined line here. So there's that. And we'll let that dry before we add the bow over top. I'm going to move on with my detailed brush while that happens. So I can add the tiny little seeds on the berry. I'm going to add even a bit more brown because I want these to really be concentrated. I don't want them to blend in too much to the berry beneath. I'm just going to start adding a few little berry seeds, very tiny little dots. And you can kind of scatter them in different directions. So obviously there's no real pattern when we're drawing strawberry seeds. And just keep them really small, with a very little amount of paint and water on the brush so that they don't get out of hand. I'm just going to dry it off and mop up a little bit of each seed color in the middle, so I don't want them to be too dark. And now while I'm here, I'm just going to grab a little bit of red to finish off the edge of my berry with the detail brush around the stem. Adding a tiny bit of water and bringing it down to define the outside of the strawberry a little bit. You can leave that as well if you don't want it to have a really defined outline. But then I'm going to do the same thing to the green stem a little bit. And I just want to add some details with a bit of watered down green over top to define where those leaves are. Maybe a bit of shading in the middle where the stem goes a bit deeper. Just bringing a couple lines down to redefine the edges of those. Nothing too major, I don't want to mess with it too much. I think it already looks good as it is, so we'll leave that part, and then we'll go back to the brown to finish off the bow. And then starting from the center here, we're just going to do a little bow that comes from the top down on both sides. So just one loop there, and one off to the side over here, and two little strings coming down there and there. And you can again drop some water into it if you want to move some of that color around. Just going to add a couple of finishing details. Taking a really white red wash, I'm going to go around and add some details to the edge of my jar to make sure it's not quite as washed out around the edges, because I want some definition around the tops and sides. And you can use some water to blend it out a little if you don't want the color to be that dark. And I'm going to add one more little strip underneath here, just as a kind of shadow and defining edge where the lid overlaps the jar. You can do the same thing at the bottom too. Just add a bit of depth here. And I'll do the same thing around the edges of the label, just to make sure there's a nice crisp edge where the sticker would be. And you can again choose to wash that out a little bit if you don't want it to be too concentrated. It's all very watered down, so really the main part here is just kind of cleaning up the edges. But you don't want to add too much water moving into the paint that's already dried, or you might get a harsh edge since you're adding more layers on top. So try to keep it pretty simple here. Just adding a couple finishing details without changing it too much. Just gonna go and touch up the edges of my bow here as well. One thing I like to do sometimes as a finishing touch is to grab like a white gel pen, or you can use acrylic white paint or gouache, and you can go in and add a couple of details to where the glass would be kind of reflecting. So I have some white jelly roll pens here, so I'm just going to use this one to add a little bit of a reflection on the edge here. A couple lines here and one where the light hit the curve here a bit. And you just want to keep it to one side because the shadow would really only be on one side. So that should be good. And then one last finishing touch I'll add. It's a little line here where the jar would curve. So using that very washed out red and kind of skipping the line a bit because I don't want it to be too defined. Doing just a couple little swipes here to where the jar would curve at the top. And there we have it, our simple little strawberry jam jar. I hope you enjoyed painting this together. Thank you so much for joining me today, and I look forward to seeing you again next time. Have a great day and have fun creating.